There is a certain satisfaction in observing how societies grapple with status, authority, and the problem of making everyone else feel slightly out of place. Few cultures have ever pursued this to such dizzying heights as the Byzantines, whose palace etiquette achieved a kind of bureaucratic perfection that made walking across a marble floor an exercise in statecraft. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. The setting is the Eastern Roman Empire, better and more confusingly known as Byzantium. The time is the height of its imperial splendor between the late 9th and 12th centuries. And the stage is Constantinople's Great Palace, a place where gold shimmered in the mosaic light and rules shimmered with even less consistency. Here, an emperor could be found behind a series of gates, screens, eunuchs, and incense clouds, and getting anywhere near him required more careful choreography than most religious ceremonies. Few empires ever devised such elaborate protocols for the simple act of entering a room. Byzantine court manuals, written in the same tone as someone assembling a particularly dangerous flat-pack shelf, prescribed everything from the angle of a bow to the precise number of steps one ought to take when approaching the throne. Forgetting a sash or mispronouncing a title was not just embarrassing, it could be interpreted as a form of treason, or at the very least, as evidence of barbarism. One gets the sense that half the population of the Great Palace was employed simply to keep track of who was allowed to wear which shade of purple. Picture. For a moment, the ordinary Byzantine official, he has spent 3 hours ensuring his shoes are properly laced. His robe is neither too short nor too long, and his beard, if allowed, is trimmed to specifications outlined in a forgotten imperial edict. He is preparing to attend an audience where he will not speak unless spoken to, will not step forward unless summoned, and will certainly not sit unless his name appears on a list that is probably outdated. Should he manage to bow at the correct angle and avoid the disgrace of tripping over his own cloak, he may be rewarded with a nod, a measured silence, or the opportunity to leave without incident. Such are the triumphs of life under the double-headed eagle. It is easy, with the benefit of centuries, to find amusement in the Byzantine devotion to ritual, yet these rules were not idle amusements. They served to remind every courtier, every visiting ambassador, and even the emperor himself, that power was measured in gestures, fabrics, and the reliable confusion of all present. The result was a society where the discomfort of others became a kind of soft power, and the ability to survive a formal audience was worth more than most diplomatic gifts. So, as the lamps flicker in imagined marble halls and corridors, echo with the footsteps of the perpetually anxious, consider what it truly meant to be in the presence of power. The story of Byzantine palace etiquette, in all its regulated glory, awaits. The city of Constantinople, known to the Byzantines as the Queen of Cities, stood at the meeting point of Europe and Asia. In the early 11th century, its population swelled with traders, priests, builders, soldiers, and petitioners, all crowding narrow streets laid out in a pattern that owed more to imperial whims than to practical city planning. The walls of Theodosius, rising in 3 formidable layers, embraced a city alive with the clatter of iron-shod hooves, the distant toll of church bells, and the shouts of hawkers moving fish, fruit, textiles, and news from the corners of empire. It was a city where the Hagia Sophia's dome shimmered above the tiled rooftops, and where the scent of incense from 100 chapels never quite masked the smell of horses, pressed cheese, and river mud. In this city, the emperor was not merely a man, he was seen as God's viceroy on earth, anointed with oil, crowned in the presence of saints' relics, and guarded by palace eunuchs, whose job it was to ensure that ritual order persisted even as the world outside shifted with every new political crisis. The Byzantine Empire at this time stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of southern Italy. It controlled trade routes that brought silk, spices, wax, and gold across continents, turning Constantinople's markets into a riot of color and unfamiliar tongues. The city's great stone forums, layered with centuries of sculpture and imperial statues, played host to everything from public trials to the distribution of bread, the latter always of interest to those who preferred their loyalty to be rewarded in something more substantial than coin. Daily life in this city did not lack for rules. Clothing was as much a statement of class as it was a shield against the coastal winds. Senators and court officials, when not tucked away in their villas or cloisters, wore long robes dyed in expensive shades, with purple reserved for only the highest offices and for the emperor himself, whose wardrobe was a state secret most tailors could only dream of glimpsing. Peasants and workers made do with garments that turned the same shade of brown after one summer spent in the markets or fields. The stones beneath one's feet were worn smooth from centuries of anxious pacing, while the palace's inner halls gleamed with mosaic floors that were waxed with something approaching devotion by servants who knew the penalty for carelessness. Religion was never far from daily business. The city boasted more churches than many towns had houses, each filled with icons, flickering tapers, and the layered scent of beeswax and myrrh. Priests moved through the streets in processions, blessing fountains and doorways, their chanting competing with the din of commerce and the lowing of oxen pulling carts laden with grain. Fasting days and feast days punctuated the months, providing both spiritual punctuation and an excuse for the markets to adjust their prices. The emperor himself presided over the most important ceremonies, processing through the great halls of the palace, clad in garments stiff with embroidery and heavy with precious stones. His entrances and exits were accompanied by court musicians, whose task it was to play the same hymns regardless of the quality of the performance or the mood of the court. Trade was both the city's lifeblood and its primary source of anxiety. Ships filled the Golden Horn, their hulls bulging with Egyptian grain, Persian silks, Russian wax, and whatever else could be convinced to cross the customs office by a sufficiently persuasive bribe. Local farmers brought vegetables, poultry, and the occasional sheep to the city's many markets, only to find that the price of entry was recorded, taxed, and occasionally revised on imperial whim. Money circulated quickly, but so did gossip. It was said that in Constantinople, news traveled faster than the wind, but accuracy came somewhere after the fourth retelling. Merchants favored the shaded colonnades of the forums, where transactions could be conducted at a safe distance from both sunlight and tax collectors. Architecture in Constantinople was a testament to imperial ambition and the Byzantine habit of not tearing anything down that might still be useful. The great palace sprawled over several terraces, connected by marble staircases, gilded doors, and a bewildering number of halls named after long-forgotten victories. The Hagia Sophia, rebuilt after the Nika riots, loomed as the most conspicuous reminder that divine favor was best expressed in vast quantities of brick and gold. Public fountains provided water, while aqueducts stretched across the city's hills, patched and mended so often that the repair crews had developed their own traditions of complaint and mildly suspicious lunch breaks. In this setting, etiquette was both shield and weapon, and knowing the rules could mean the difference between a promising career and sudden exile. The palace was a world apart, its routines dictated by manuals that described in painful detail how to stand, when to speak, and where to look. The rules did not make the city run any more smoothly, but they did ensure that everyone knew their place and that nobody, least of all the emperor, was ever surprised by the wrong kind of enthusiasm. With the scene set, the curious complexities of Byzantine palace etiquette can now be observed briskly and in their natural habitat. Within the walls of the great palace, the routines of etiquette did not merely uphold the dignity of the emperor. They maintained the delicate order of a society practiced in hierarchies and appearances. In the early 11th century, the reigning emperor, Basil II, exemplified this balance. Known for his lack of personal flair, but formidable tenacity in politics and warfare, He nevertheless presided over a court where even the blending of incense was subject to silent judgment. Protocol extended beyond the emperor's person and seeped into every corridor, audience chamber, and mosaic-lined hallway. Visitors to the palace, whether ambitious local officials or foreign envoys, quickly learned that entering imperial precincts was a ritual in itself. Gates were opened by eunuchs, whose knowledge of precedents rivaled that of any lawyer, and whose ability to detect an incorrectly paired sash or misplaced brooch was legendary. The air was scented with burned frankincense, mingling with the subtler smells of beeswax, polished marble, and an unspoken anxiety. Silence reigned in the corridors, interrupted only by the soft patter of felt-slippered feet. Shoes were not to mar the floors, and the servant's discretion ensured that no unnecessary noise disturbed the peace. Those who failed to heed these customs could expect to be quietly corrected, or, in the case of repeat offenders, to find themselves waiting in the outer courtyards for an audience that never quite materialized. Life for most courtiers revolved around anticipation. The day began with dawn prayers, offered in the small palace chapels, where priests recited liturgies and flickering lamps cast long shadows across painted walls. Meals were regular, but rarely lavish, unless the emperor was entertaining, in which case the tables might groan under the weight of fish, stuffed birds, pale loaves, honeyed wine, and bowls of imported fruit. Even then, the guests ate according to rank, with the most valued seated closest to the emperor and served first, while the less fortunate eyed platters that always seemed to reach them at room temperature. Trade links continued to underpin palace life, reflected not only in the variety of foods and textiles, but also in the presence of translators, foreign scribes and interpreters. These individuals, often overlooked in grand accounts, moved quietly between lavish halls and drafty storerooms. Their services essential in a court where a single misunderstanding of Latin or Arabic could turn a meeting into an international incident. The palace itself was a small world, containing its own bakeries, armories, baths, and gardens. Servants spent hours polishing silver, tending to ornamental shrubs, or simply waiting for the next bell that signaled an imperial summons. The gardens, planted with cypress, laurel, and carefully contained vines, were said to be a reminder of paradise, though for many their chief attraction was a rare patch of shade and a break from the dizzying pattern of marble corridors. Religion continued to saturate the court's routines. Mosaics of Christ Pantocrator and the Virgin Mary watched over every formal procession, and icons were kissed with measured reverence by all who passed. On important feast days, the palace chapel filled with the sound of chanting so resonant that the stone columns seemed to hum along. Even the emperor was subject to the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. His public appearances, timed to coincide with major services or the distribution of battered copper coins to the poor. Surviving records reveal that the court maintained an entire staff to track holy days and coordinate the appropriate vestments, since an error in this department could become the subject of weeks of whispered complaint. Beyond the palace walls, the city remained a hive of activity. Markets thrived on the constant movement of goods. Silk bolts from Anatolia, wax from the Black Sea, wheat from the lands around the Bosporus. Agricultural produce arrived daily, although it was never quite enough to dispel the city's chronic anxiety about shortages. Those who could afford it installed tiled hearths in their homes to bake bread or roast meats. But the majority relied on bakeries and public ovens, the latter operating with a reliability that could only be described as seasonal. Civic life was similarly patterned. Factions met in taverns and church courtyards, debating the outcome of chariot races or the wisdom of imperial tax policies, and always in the same tone of weary inevitability. News from the frontiers arrived with the regularity of the tides, though as often as not it arrived hopelessly out of date. Amid these routines, the etiquette of the palace was understood as a world apart, its own ecosystem of gestures, correct responses, and intricate exclusion. For all the splendor of purple robes and golden halls, comfort was reserved for a very few. Even the emperor, surrounded by ceremony, performed his own rituals of deference to the icons and relics that defined his rule. In the end, the lines between the sacred, the formal, and the merely inconvenient blurred in a city built upon tradition, faith, and the abiding certainty that somewhere, someone was being scolded for standing in the wrong place. As the day's first audience approached, and the palace's courtiers adjusted their robes for the 5th time, it was clear that the peculiar order of Byzantium would persist for another day, unmoved by complaint or innovation. As the palace settled into its morning rhythm, the choreography of court life revealed its true complexity. Each rank of official knew precisely how many steps to take, how long to bow, and which mosaic tile not to cross without invitation. The journey from the sunlit garden colonnades to the shadowed audience hall was both literal and symbolic, and it provided ample opportunity for reflection, mostly on the consequences of being out of sequence. Pages and attendants moved quietly, carrying scrolls and documents in hands washed more often than was typical elsewhere in the empire. The greater the proximity to the emperor, the greater the fear of smudged parchment or unclean fingers. Politics remained an undercurrent in every exchange, whether a whispered discussion by the fountain or a prolonged silence in a corridor. The Emperor Basil II, having spent much of his reign on campaign, viewed the intricacies of court ceremony with the same stamina he applied to siege warfare. His court was famous for retaining elaborate protocols, even as it shed much of the theatricality that had colored the reign of earlier emperors. Basil's preference for simple dress and direct speech, however, did nothing to ease the anxieties of courtiers who continued to outdo themselves in their interpretation of the ceremonial handbooks. For most, it was safer to err on the side of caution, for in the palace, a misplaced glance could undo years of careful advancement. Life beyond the ceremonial halls continued in its own measured fashion. In the kitchens, cooks prepared meals that balanced imperial abundance with Byzantine thrift. Fish from the Bosporus was steamed or salted. Fowl was stuffed with herbs and grains, and loaves were baked to a density that ensured they could endure a week's worth of handling. Sweetmeats and fresh fruit made rare appearances at the table, with the former reserved for days of particular celebration. The clatter of earthenware and the scent of roasting meats drifted through the palace wings, only to be carefully contained by servants, charged with maintaining the dignified silence of the inner chambers. Religion intersected with court life in ways both predictable and unexpected. Processions moved through the palace on holy days, led by priests swinging censers heavy with incense, the sweet-smelling smoke curling around carved pillars and gold-encrusted icons. Ritual bathing and carefully timed prayers were interwoven into the daily schedule, often announced by the ringing of handbells. These ceremonies, far from being mere formality, served as visible reminders of the emperor's semi-divine status and the court's relationship with the church. Disputes over precedents in religious observance were handled with a subtlety equal to that of political disagreements. No one wanted to be seen as insufficiently pious, but over-enthusiasm risked suspicion. Commerce, meanwhile, crept into the palace at every opportunity, though wrapped in the polite fiction of gift-giving and tribute. Diplomats arriving from distant Armenia, Ros, or the Caliphate of Baghdad brought gifts calculated to impress and confuse in equal measure. The receiving of such offerings was a formal affair, with attendants noting every detail for the record. The correct response to an over-generous donor was a topic of endless quiet debate, as was the question of whether certain items should be displayed, stored, or discreetly disposed of. Occasionally, a particularly impressive gift would result in a new protocol being written solely to accommodate its presence. Agriculture and the needs of the palace provided another layer of daily activity. Baskets of produce arrived from imperial estates on the city's edge: grapes, figs, olives, and sacks of wheat, all inspected with meticulous care before reaching the kitchens. The palace gardens, visible through latticed windows, were tended by teams of gardeners who maintained beds of flowering herbs, fragrant shrubs, and occasionally an exotic specimen brought back from the emperor's campaigns. Water for the palace was drawn from cisterns and aqueducts, the maintenance of which was a source of both pride and frequent complaint. Within this orderly world, architecture remained a backdrop of stone and gold. Audience halls were sheathed in colored marble and mosaic panels, punctuated by columns that seemed designed as much to impress as to support. Light filtered in through alabaster windows, dappling the walls with a glow that was sometimes mistaken for divine favor. Even ordinary corridors were lined with patterns meant to impress the passing eye, though most who hurried by were less concerned with art than with reaching their appointed place on time. Furniture, built to endure generations, provided little comfort and much ceremony. Benches and thrones were positioned according to rank, and the act of sitting or standing became another expression of the social order. As the day unfolded, the routines of etiquette, religion, and politics pressed on in their familiar loops. For the few who achieved true comfort in this world, there was always the risk that a new protocol or a small change in imperial preference could sweep away years of careful adjustment. Nothing in the great palace was ever as settled as it appeared, and those who flourished were those who understood that routine, in Byzantium, was rarely routine for long. As the day drifted on within the palace, the boundaries between personal ambition and collective ritual became ever more apparent. Courtiers, diplomats, and servants participated in a system so layered that understanding it fully was less a matter of education and more a lifetime's careful observation. In the service corridors, those too junior to have titles repeated the gestures and phrases of their superiors, hopeful that attentive mimicry might one day earn them advancement, or, at the very least, keep them from official reprimand. The routine was relentless, but strangely reassuring. The knowledge that every bow, every pause, had been performed by predecessors for generations, and would likely be judged by successors with equal scrutiny. The political atmosphere of Basil II's later reign was defined as much by what was left unsaid as by formal proclamations. Having subdued internal rivals and gained a reputation for relentless campaigns against Bulgaria, Basil's presence in Constantinople was both stabilizing and unnerving. Those at court watched for signs of imperial favor in small gestures, a nod, an invitation, or the absence of a frown. The risk of falling from grace was a real and persistent feature of daily life, tempered only by the awareness that even those of humble rank could, with patience and caution, ascend to unexpected heights. Conversely, the mighty sometimes vanished from view in a manner so discreet that later chroniclers struggled to determine the exact date of their departure. Religious observance continued to weave through every aspect of courtly routine. Upon the striking of bells, courtiers and staff gathered for prayers, their ranks aligned as carefully as their wardrobes. Incense hung in the air, clinging to the stone walls and filtering through carved screens, faintly sweet, even hours after ceremonies ended. Above the heads of the congregation, gold mosaics glimmered with images of saints and martyrs, their expressions as impassive as the eunuchs who kept watch at the chapel doors. On major feast days, the energy in the palace shifted. Lay and clerical officials jostled for optimal viewing places, and the kitchen staff braced for the ordeal of preparing meals for gatherings whose numbers always seemed to grow by the hour. Trade continued to link the palace to the wider Mediterranean and beyond. Messengers and merchants arrived by sea and land, their approach often signaled by the lowing of exhausted oxen or the shouts of customs officials on the quay. Foreign dignitaries were accompanied up the palace avenues by carefully chosen escorts, who pointed out the mosaics, fountains, and courtyards with the practiced enthusiasm of those whose own opinions were never solicited. The gifts these visitors brought, fabrics dyed in improbable hues, ivory boxes, and intricately cast metalwork, were presented with elaborate speeches, each translated and recorded with a formality that rendered generosity almost bureaucratic. Scribes made notes as quickly as the visitors spoke, ink staining their fingers and sleeves. Agriculture's importance was never out of mind. Especially as the seasons changed and the full harvest or lean months approached. Notices arrived from the countryside, reporting on grain yields, vineyard health, or the appearance of pests in olive groves. Such reports were studied by palace officials with a seriousness that easily matched their interest in foreign affairs. Each year, a portion of the city's bread supply was set aside for distribution during festivals, ensuring that imperial generosity could be witnessed and, just as importantly, remembered. The connection between rural toil and urban splendor was maintained by a constant movement of wagons and barges, their drivers navigating narrow alleys and bustling markets with a resigned patience. The architectural rhythm of the palace shaped the flow of life inside its walls. Halls designed for grand processions lay quiet between ceremonies, their marble floors echoing even a gentle footstep. In smaller chambers, light filtered through colored glass, softening the sharp outlines of furniture and banners. Servants moved silently, their arms full of linens or platters, their faces schooled to polite neutrality. The temperature in these rooms shifted with the sun, reminding all who dwelled there that comfort remained a relative concept. To live in the Byzantine palace was to be part of a carefully maintained spectacle, one that demanded constant vigilance, obedience to shifting codes, and a willingness to adapt as circumstances required. The rules were often confusing, sometimes contradictory, but they offered a sense of stability, even as their details drifted. As the light of afternoon faded, and the palace prepared for another round of audiences, banquets, and solemn rites, one could sense the unbroken thread of tradition that stretched back through centuries, a thread as tangible, in its way, as the embroidered borders of an imperial robe. Evening in the Byzantine palace was no less orchestrated than the rest of the day, though the pace softened as daylight dwindled. Lamps of finely worked bronze and glass were lit along colonnades, casting a warm glow on the marble surfaces and flickering in the gold tesserae of the mosaics. The subtle scent of lamp oil mingled with the lingering smoke of incense, wrapping the corridors in an atmosphere that was as much ceremonial as it was practical. Some attendants moved through the halls with trays of bread and cheese, the crust hardened by hours of exposure, while others collected discarded scrolls and swept away the day's detritus. The murmur of distant voices became more subdued. The business of court was never truly finished, but it was now conducted in tones muffled by the heavy tapestries and thick stone walls. At this hour, the emperor would often retire to a private chamber or the palace chapel, flanked by trusted eunuchs and clerics. These moments of withdrawal were as much a display of authority as his public appearances. A ruler's privacy in Byzantium was not simply a matter of comfort, but a carefully preserved element of statecraft, enforced by endless corridors, locked gates, and the discretion of staff whose livelihoods depended on their silence. Only the most favored advisors would be summoned for matters requiring urgent attention. The rest of the court, meanwhile, occupied itself with whispered speculation, ever alert for signs of shifting favor or impending dismissal. Evenings also brought a shift in religious observance. Vespers was marked by a simple but deliberate procession to the palace chapel, where the lamps burned brighter and the air thickened with prayer. The choir's voices, trained for clarity over beauty, gave the familiar hymns a sharpness that resonated against the stone. Relics and icons, displayed in arched recesses, caught the lamplight and seemed, to some, to watch over the proceedings with a patient indifference. Participation in these devotions was not optional, and absences were rarely excused, though it was quietly understood that the most senior officials had perfected the art of appearing pious while thinking of more pressing matters. Meanwhile, the rhythm of trade continued just beyond the palace boundaries. The city's docks bustled after dark with the arrival of ships carrying goods from the Black Sea and beyond. Longshoremen unloaded amphorae of oil and wine, their shouts punctuating the otherwise steady hum of the city. Markets within the palace remained closed, but appointed stewards tracked the day's receipts and tallied stores, a routine that generated enough paperwork to fill a scriptorium. It was a common understanding that the palace's appetite for supplies, be it for high feasts or quiet meals, was rivaled only by its appetite for records and receipts. The agricultural cycles shaping life beyond the city made themselves felt inside the palace in small but significant ways. The quality of the bread, the sweetness of the fruit, and the freshness of fish all betrayed the current state of the countryside. During lean harvests, discussions in the hallways grew more anxious, and inventories were checked with greater frequency. In years of plenty, the abundance was displayed, not with extravagance, but with a calculated generosity. As surplus grain or olives were distributed to select churches, and the city's needy, such gestures reinforced the emperor's reputation as a provider. Though the act of giving was, in itself, a well-rehearsed ceremony, within the palace walls, architecture continued to shape the evening's progress. Hallways narrowed near the private apartments, the floors covered with heavy carpets that muted footsteps, decorative screens carved with intricate designs, separated public spaces from the secluded quarters reserved for family and the highest officials. The lingering light revealed the careful joinery of doors and shutters, evidence of craftsmen whose skill was measured as much by what was hidden as by what was displayed. Rooms cooled quickly as the sun set, and servants moved braziers from chamber to chamber, keeping the worst of the night air at bay. As darkness settled fully over Constantinople, the city's distant noises faded, and the palace withdrew into a hush, broken only by the turning of locks and the occasional clink of utensils at a late supper. Those who remained awake did so with purpose. Scribes finished the day's reports by lamplight, and a handful of officials reviewed schedules for the following morning, already planning the order of audiences and the seating at the next ceremonial meal. The routines of Byzantine etiquette and authority, so visible in daylight, were no less powerful in these quieter hours. In this measured retreat, the machinery of imperial life continued to turn, maintained not by spectacle alone, but by a constant, almost invisible, discipline. Night in the Byzantine palace arrived with a certainty that owed as much to routine as to the movement of planets. The streets of Constantinople outside faded into a darkness, disrupted only by torches at the city gates, or the occasional lantern carried by a patrol. Inside the palace, the transition was marked by small, observable rituals. Windows were shuttered and barred, outer doors were checked and locked, and courtiers, still wandering the public halls, were gently reminded by discreet stewards that their business was surely complete for the day. The gentle closing of heavy doors, the quiet padding of slippered feet, and the soft murmur of final reports gave the palace a sense of retreat that only deepened as the hours wore on. In private quarters, life was more subdued. Those with the privilege of apartments within the palace's core settled into routines shaped by necessity and habit. Sleep was not always easily found. The stone walls held the day's chill, and the flickering light of a single oil lamp was often all that stood between comfort and the suggestion of shadows. Some read, or at least pretended to read, from illuminated manuscripts, their eyes tracing the careful lines of Greek script. Others reviewed messages from distant relatives, reports from family estates, or boringly detailed household inventories. The scribes who maintained imperial records continued to work late, their arms aching as they copied out lists of gifts received, punishments issued, repairs ordered, and minor events observed, each destined to be stored in an archive that grew heavier with every passing year. The emperor's own evening schedule, while guarded from casual observation, adhered to certain understood patterns: a final consultation with favored advisors, an inspection of security arrangements, or a brief visit to the chapel might be interspersed with rare moments of private contemplation. Basil II, ever cautious, was known to favor simplicity over display, preferring quiet conversation to loud celebration. Meals, when taken, were modest. It was widely remarked that imperial dinners, during his later years, featured more bread, fish, and stewed greens than golden goblets or elaborate confections. Still, the presence of well-trained servants ensured that even the simplest course was presented with a seriousness usually reserved for diplomatic receptions. Elsewhere in the palace, servants made their final rounds. Beds were prepared with coarse linen sheets, their surfaces firm enough to discourage both idleness and complaint. Fires were banked and braziers replenished, though the relief was uneven. One end of a room might be nearly warm, while the other clung to the chill of the Bosporus night air. In the kitchens, remnants of supper were quietly packed away, or sent to feed staff whose duties extended well into the darkness. Those without the privilege of private rooms, guards, porters, junior clerks, huddled together in small chambers, sharing what warmth and stories they could before sleep overtook them. The rhythms of urban life, beyond the palace, remained just audible. The distant sound of waves against the sea walls, the faint call of watchmen, and the muted creak of wagon wheels persisted into the night. For most, such noises were the backdrop to dreams shaped by the realities of grain quotas, tax demands, or the unpredictable tides of court favor. The relationship between city and palace, always intimate and often uneasy, was never more apparent than in these hours when both seemed to breathe according to the same careful pattern. Religion, too, held its place after dark. Small votive lamps burned in private niches, casting trembling halos around painted icons. Some whispered prayers before sleep, tracing the sign of the cross as a precaution against the hazards of the world and their own ambitions. Monks attached to the palace chapel kept vigil through the night, reciting psalms and tending to relics as the lesser clergy slept. The sound of their chanting, if it did not disturb, at least reminded all within earshot that even in darkness, the order of Byzantine piety endured. The architectural details that defined palace life by day took on a different character at night. The intricate carvings along lintels and archways became patterns of shadow and suggestion. Polished floors lost their brilliance, replaced by the hush of footfalls and the occasional clink of a dropped key. Tapestries thickened the silence, absorbing stray sounds and providing a measure of privacy otherwise unknown in so crowded a place. Those who paced the corridors, after hours, found themselves alone, not only with their thoughts, but with the weight of tradition and the certainty that in the Byzantine world, every hour was accounted for, if not in official records, then at least in the minds of those who had survived another uninterrupted day. Morning in the Byzantine palace arrived with little ceremony. For most, those charged with the care of the endless hallways and courtyards stirred first, rising before the faintest streak of light touched the city's rooftops. Kitchen servants rekindled fires in ovens large enough to bake bread for hundreds, their movements brisk and practiced as they measured out flour, fetched water from cisterns, and stacked kindling that never seemed to dry completely. During the colder months, the smell of yeast and smoke drifted through the lower levels, mingling with the particular dampness of stone that had absorbed centuries of spilled water, chatter, and the worries of minor officials. For palace officials and courtiers, the pace was more measured. Robes laid out the previous evening were examined once more, in the pale light, sleeves checked for stains or damage that might invite comment. A misaligned hem or faded sash could be the cause of a morning spent defending one's reputation. So time was invested in small corrections. Eunuchs, ever watchful and seldom hurried, moved quietly through the corridors, their presence both reassuring and slightly unnerving. They carried the day's orders on wax tablets, distributing assignments and reminders with a careful neutrality that discouraged both gratitude and complaint. As the sun rose above the city's walls, its light caught on the domes and gilded crosses of the palace's chapels. Bells rang out for the first round of prayers, drawing a trickle of clerics and courtiers to the nave. The air in these chambers was thick with incense, the scent lingering on every surface, as if intent on outlasting the stone itself. A priest in elaborate vestments began the liturgy, his voice echoing beneath arches painted with scenes of saints and emperors past. Attendance was expected, if not always wholehearted. For many, these moments served as a necessary ritual before the real business of the day began. Political life resumed with the convening of councils and the arrival of messengers. Diplomatic correspondence awaited review, sealed with wax, imprinted by the signets of far-off rulers or regional governors seeking favor or clarification. Advisors gathered in outer chambers, paging through carefully maintained lists and recent reports. Imperial audiences were scheduled according to rank, urgency, and, occasionally, the unpredictable preferences of the emperor. When Basil II presided, the atmosphere was restrained. His reputation for severity was matched by an intolerance for unnecessary ceremony. Yet the system he inherited was not so easily bent to the preferences of a single man. Protocol required that even the most routine petition be accompanied by a procession, an introduction, and a brief but formal pause before the emperor responded. Economic life was visible in the steady arrival of goods at the palace's various entry points. Wagons laden with vegetables, amphorae of wine, and crates of salted fish awaited inspection by stewards who checked not only contents but also quantities, and in times of worry, the loyalty of those delivering them. Markets in the city bustled as traders jostled for space and advantage, but within the palace, the distribution of supplies was carefully managed. The record-keeping, as ever, rivaled the bureaucracy of any small kingdom, with officials noting discrepancies in ledgers that grew heavier and more incomprehensible each year. As the day wore on, cooks selected ingredients for noon meals and afternoon feasts, giving preference to the freshest produce and the least contentious invoices. Agriculture's influence could be seen in the supplies taken up from imperial estates. Olive oil, figs, and honey from distant countryside arrived in wax-sealed pots, accompanied by the inevitable complaints about transport and weather. The quality of these goods was a matter of consequence for kitchen staff and for those charged with distributing surplus to church and poor alike. When grain was plentiful, its abundance was noted in sermons and imperial announcements. In lean years, officials debated the wisdom of cutting rations or raising prices, a decision rarely made without at least a week of anxious discussion and consultation with those who might plausibly deflect the blame. Architectural maintenance resumed with the return of daylight. Masons tapped at walls in search of loose plaster, while painters touched up fading saints on chapel ceilings. The relentless tide of repairs kept skilled craftsmen employed through all seasons, their work both admired and resented by those whose own routines depended on unobstructed corridors and silence during prayer. Throughout the palace, life continued with the quiet assurance that every task, no matter how tedious, contributed in some way to the ongoing spectacle of imperial order. As morning faded to midday, the machinery of Byzantine etiquette and bureaucracy pressed forward, unchanged and unhurried, watched over by walls that seemed to have witnessed every permutation of human effort and expectation. As midday approached in the palace, sunlight slipped through latticed windows, catching on the inlaid marble floors and the polished metalwork that adorned the hallways. The air grew warmer, carrying with it the mingled aromas of roasting meat, herbs, and bread baked fresh only hours before. The courtyards were briefly alive with activity, as servants and minor officials hurried between wings, carrying trays, messages, and the latest snippets of court news, most of which would already be outdated by the time it reached the ears of those who mattered. The clatter of sandal soles on stone was a familiar accompaniment to the business of the hour. Within the great halls, preparations for the midday meal took on the character of a ceremonial exercise. Tables were set out and draped in heavy linens, their surfaces arranged according to rank and precedence. Dishes were chosen as much to impress as to satisfy hunger. The imperial kitchens sent forth platters of lamb, bowls of lentils, and stewed greens, while bakers provided small loaves marked with the imperial seal, a reminder, if one were needed, of who ultimately controlled the grain. Seating was a matter of both privilege and anxiety, and the placement of each guest became the subject of quiet scrutiny. A less fortunate official might find himself seated too far from the emperor or too close to a rival, the implications of which could occupy his thoughts longer than the food itself. For those invited to dine in the emperor's presence, etiquette governed every gesture. One did not speak unless spoken to, did not begin eating until the emperor himself had touched his first morsel, and certainly did not request anything unless it appeared on the table by imperial design. The meal passed in measured conversation, often focused on matters of state or the more pressing challenges of the city: grain shipments, border unrest, the latest building repairs, and the perennial issue of tax collection. The voices of officials and ambassadors blended with the gentle clink of pottery and metal, and the occasional cough or clatter of a dropped cup was noted but not remarked upon. Religion, never far from any moment in palace life, found its way into the meal as well. Grace was said before and after, with a short reading offered by a cleric seated near the head table. The presence of icons in the dining chamber was a reminder that daily business and faith were meant to be inseparable. Courtiers crossed themselves with practiced indifference, careful not to draw attention to either enthusiasm or neglect. The menu reflected the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. On fasting days, fish or vegetables replaced meat, and wine was limited to a single cup, though observance of these rules sometimes depended on the mood of the emperor or the influence of his spiritual advisors. Elsewhere in the palace, work continued with the same blend of urgency and resignation that characterized Byzantine administration. Scribes recorded the outcomes of meetings and meals, scribbling notes on wax tablets for later transfer to more permanent scrolls. Gardeners tended the inner courtyards, pruning vines and sweeping away fallen leaves. Artisans repaired chipped stonework or retouched the gilding on doorways that saw constant use. Messengers passed through guarded archways, carrying correspondence stamped with seals of red wax and bound with twisted string. Some of these notes contained news of far-off conflicts or trade negotiations. Others simply confirmed the delivery of a dozen fresh cheeses or the return of a missing serving ladle. Beyond the palace, the city continued its own midday routines. The hum of commerce was more subdued, as many shops and workshops closed briefly for prayer or rest. In the markets, traders retreated to shaded corners, their goods covered with linens to keep the sun off. The city's wells remained busy, as water carriers filled jars for households and bathhouses alike. The ever-present sounds of Constantinople, bells from churches, the braying of animals, the shouts of hawkers, filtered faintly through palace windows, softened by distance and the thickness of the walls. As the meal drew to a close, courtiers slipped away in small groups, each careful to observe the formalities of departure. The emperor typically remained behind for a time, consulting with his closest advisors, while servants cleared the tables in near silence. The scent of food lingered in the air, mingling with the ever-present perfume of incense and beeswax. Afternoon in the palace settled into a quieter rhythm, but the machinery of state continued to function. Reports were delivered, repairs resumed, and, in shaded porticos, the first quiet preparations for evening rituals began to take shape. The day pressed forward, marked by routines so ingrained that even small deviations became the subject of private comment and gentle correction. Afternoon in the Byzantine palace settled into a pattern of subdued industry. Well practiced and largely immune to the passage of time, sunlight shifted across the interior courtyards, dappling statues and tiled pathways, as attendants carried out their duties with an efficiency born of repetition. The clink of tools and the murmur of conversation drifted from the workshops, where metalworkers repaired ceremonial lamps and woodworkers smoothed benches that had endured generations of anxious occupants. In the more secluded gardens, scribes seated themselves beneath shade trees, their wax tablets balanced on their knees, noting the day's correspondence or recording the minutes of meetings that would later become part of the imperial record. One destined, like so many others, to be reviewed with concern or ignored altogether. The palace bureaucracy, for which Byzantium was justly known, reached its peak in these hours. Clerks and eunuchs moved between offices, consulting code books and legal scrolls, muttering quietly about the latest imperial decrees and the inevitable confusion that followed any new regulation. The flow of paperwork never ceased. An order for repairing a damaged mosaic in a side chapel might take days to appear at the stonemason's doorstep, while an edict concerning tax exemptions could be discussed for weeks before a single coin changed hands. Nonetheless, the slow pace was accepted as the price of avoiding disastrous haste. A lesson learned by many and forgotten only by the most impatient. Politics rarely rested in the afternoon. While imperial audiences were less frequent at this hour, the palace's shadowy colonnades and anterooms became the sites of quieter negotiations and cautious inquiries after patronage. It was in these moments, over midday wine or during a stroll along shaded porticos, that fortunes were sometimes made or unmade. Favor could hinge on a comment remembered from lunch or a name recalled in a conversation about distant provinces. The risk of offending the wrong person, even unintentionally, lingered in every exchange. It was not unusual for a rising official to trace his fortune back, not to brilliance or loyalty, but to the good sense of sitting in silence. When a senior advisor began to complain about the price of imported paper. Meanwhile, the pulse of religion persisted. A handful of clergy moved among the halls, blessing newly hung tapestries, or arranging for prayers to be said for the health of the imperial family. The chapel doors were rarely closed for long, and the scent of incense seemed to gather more thickly in the air as the day grew warmer. In quiet corners, icons caught stray shafts of light, gold halos, and painted robes gleaming against the gloom. Even in private apartments, devotional routines were observed. Candles were lit before painted saints, and short prayers murmured in the hope that divine favor might outlast the day's anxieties. Trade was less visible inside palace walls, though its effects were never far. A late arrival of fruit or oil from imperial estates provided material for comment among both the cooks and the clerks. A shortage of salt or spices could provoke small adjustments in the day's menus and larger ones in the accounting ledgers. Gifts sent to the palace, textiles dyed in deep purples, jars of honey, finely worked glass, were stored, inspected, and occasionally displayed in hopes of impressing a foreign envoy or a junior member of the imperial household. The arrival of a particularly remarkable item would prompt a new flurry of discussion among those responsible for protocol, as precedents had to be carefully maintained, even in matters of taste and decoration. Architecture, never quite still, responded to the rhythms of the afternoon. The palace's halls were designed to remain cool, even as the sun reached its height, their thick walls and shaded arcades making movement through the building a relief from the heat outside. Maintenance crews took advantage of the lull, tending to dripping fountains or adjusting heavy curtains to protect painted walls from the sun. In the largest audience chambers, servants dusted mosaic floors and adjusted benches, preparing for whatever event might fill the space next, be it a council meeting, a small feast, or an unscheduled inspection by the emperor himself. As the shadows lengthened and the afternoon waned, the routines of the palace continued, undisturbed by the possibility of change. The business of empire was neither swift nor spectacular. Rather, it was a matter of habit, caution, and the quiet conviction that order, however tedious, was preferable to uncertainty. Those who thrived in this world did so, not by challenging its pace, but by mastering its intricacies, one carefully considered gesture at a time. As the afternoon slipped quietly toward evening, the palace's pulse slowed, but never ceased altogether. In shaded galleries, clerks finished copying records onto parchment, each sheet pressed and marked in a hand so precise that it seemed almost designed to resist misinterpretation. The smell of ink mingled with the faint aroma of oil lamps, freshly trimmed in anticipation of the fading light A few senior officials, having concluded their consultations, moved through the corridors with a deliberation that suggested both dignity and fatigue. Their sandals scuffed gently against mosaic floors, careful not to disturb the work of servants rearranging benches or adjusting screens for the next round of formalities. By this hour, the palace gardens stood in a gentle hush. The sun's warmth lingered on gravel paths and marble basins, where gardeners methodically pruned the last dry leaves of the season and swept fallen blossoms into small, tidy heaps. The air was thick with the scent of laurel and rosemary, punctuated by the occasional chirp from the city's sparrows. In one shaded corner, a junior scribe recited a passage from a legal text to himself, his voice quiet enough to avoid the attention of anyone more senior who might be tempted to quiz him on the finer points of imperial law. The city beyond the palace gates was preparing for its own transition. Market vendors packed away their goods, lifting baskets of figs, onions, and dried fish onto carts bound for storage, or the waiting barges along the Golden Horn. The bells of distant churches sounded in slow succession, marking the approach of Vespers. The air from the harbour carried hints of brine and smoke, while the muffled clatter of hooves and wheels on cobblestones drifted through the city's crowded lanes. Constantinople, for all its reputation for intrigue and bustle, had learned the value of a predictable routine. Even the city's beggars could be found, making their way to favoured corners before the evening chill set in. Within the palace, religious observance reclaimed its importance. As light waned, clerics moved quietly along the halls, summoning courtiers and staff to evening prayers. The palace chapel, with its domed ceiling flickering in the glow of hanging lamps, filled gradually with the soft rustle of robes and the low hum of whispered greetings. A deacon began the service with a chant, his voice rising in measured tones that resonated against the painted stone. Icons watched from their gilded niches, and the same prayers heard for centuries were recited once again, an act so familiar that one could almost forget how easily routine could unravel in less disciplined hands. In the kitchens, preparations began for the evening meal. Large pots stewed over slow fires, their contents checked and stirred by cooks whose attention to detail rivaled that of any palace clerk. Roasted fowl, seasoned with garlic and herbs, was arranged on platters beside bowls of barley porridge and dried fruit. Bread, pulled fresh from the oven, split open with a satisfying crackle and gave off a reassuring steam. The chief steward checked the stores, mindful of every missing jar or miscounted olive, for both scarcity and surplus provoked their own forms of comment. Servants moved swiftly with baskets and trays, careful not to spill or drop anything that might become the subject of idle complaint at table. The emperor's own household, always a step removed from the ordinary, reflected both the burdens and privileges of rule. Basil II, as was his custom, dined in relative simplicity, surrounded by a selected handful of advisors and trusted eunuchs. Conversation might drift from matters of state to practical concerns, the condition of the city's walls, the latest reports from the frontiers, or the less glamorous reality of palace repairs, delayed by disputes over cost or labor. While the meal was modest, the performance of etiquette remained exacting. Each gesture and utterance reinforced the order on which the palace depended. As twilight arrived, the palace settled into its evening rhythm. Lamps were lit in the halls, their warm light pooling on polished stone and casting long shadows against painted walls. Courtiers dispersed to their quarters, some pausing in small groups to exchange quiet remarks about the day's events. The scent of spiced wine drifted from private rooms, mingling with the faint, lingering incense from the chapel. Night approached with a steadiness that suited the Byzantine temperament, routine, measured, and always prepared to meet the next day with the same blend of caution and persistence.